let's begin. Thank you all for coming today. I'll be talking on advanced permissions system with built-in groups, which was developed for a hello, which was developed for a client with specific requirements, which I'll be going through later on. We'll be going first through a couple of things just to get a scope of what's happening and what's needed, and later down the session we'll be going through the actual code. So a quick introduction, you already know, my name is Jan. I'm a Drupal developer at Dropsolid, and these are my handles where you can reach out to me if you need me. So on the permission system that I want to talk about is something that I said we developed a couple of years ago. It was for a Royal College institution in the UK, and what the requirements were there were that they have these regions throughout the country, and within those regions they have different roles. So there are some administrators, some supervisors, some doctors, trainees, and things like those, and they all put in content. And within those regions, different people with different roles can then access or not access those entities, or basically content that are inside. So the requirement was that there were a couple of different entities that we needed to put in, a couple of different roles, and also we needed to set different permissions based on different things. Essentially what you already see in Drupal in terms of roles and permissions, but within this region ecosystem. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why is it so advanced or different? Because yeah, groups already have that all built in. So essentially you have a group entity, and in there you have a group content entity, and that group content entity then basically has a reference on that content that you want to put into the group. With that, you can also obviously set the different roles and also permissions. Now, this was all fine in theory, but the thing was that when we looked at the whole thing, so we had about, I think it was close to 40,000 users, and out of those 40,000 users, they generated around 750,000 content. All of that was put in, and then it was just a bit of a hassle if we really wanted to go with that, because that would mean a lot of entity references, a lot of stuff being there put into the database. We needed to do some queries here and there, so essentially we just decided to go for a bit more custom approach. Still, we used whatever groups and core provided us with, but it was a bit different, and we'll see how that goes and how it implements in. So the things that we needed to have, obviously entity level access. Whoever is on the platform at any time, if he wants to view an entity, might be a user, might be a piece of content, might be a document, media, whatever. At that time, the group permission, the system needed to kick in and either allow or disallow access to that user. Second bit is list level access. So we also had a search API, and you had a search page. You also had, I think there were a couple of other different pages where basically you listed those items, users or content. And obviously, we always are going to have some special cases. It wouldn't be a client project if the client didn't come in later and said, well, you know, there's this case and this case where access needed to act a bit differently. So starting off, we first needed to see how we are going to allow the new entities. So whatever the entities are, because we also had a lot of the different custom entities. we also needed to figure out how to put those entities into groups. And that was actually a very simple thing because Groups itself already provides you with a plugin. It's called Group Content Enabler, which we'll see later in action. And essentially, we just put a couple of different base classes just to help us when we are adding new entities in and to have those kind of shared functionalities in between. So on the entity level access, we so if you know how an entity access works, there's this huge annotation, basically a comment on the class, and inside there's some pieces of information. And one of those pieces of information is the access handler. So that's essentially a class which has a functionality. It has some methods inside, and basically that's the piece of content, the file, the class, the thing that allows you access, that determines if you are able to access that piece of content. So when we had custom entities, obviously we already have access to those files. We can basically just change the annotation and be done with it, and that would be it. But we also needed to override the existing ones. So for example, for notes, for users, media was one, file entity was one. Essentially anything that comes with core or maybe with a different contrib module, we needed to have a way to override those access handlers inside. On the list level access, so when you see a listing, the entities are being rendered. So at that time, the entity level access already kicks in, which sort of makes it fine and okay. But the thing was that, for example, if you have a listing and you might have a summary on the top, which is going to say showing you 10 items out of 20,000. The thing is, if just with the entity access, the entity level access, you wouldn't really see the entity, so that would be fine. But the results there, the summary, wouldn't actually be correct. Because it might be that in the first 10 items that you see on the page, you don't have access to 5 of those, which means you would only be seeing 5 items in there. But the summary would still say showing you 10 items. So what we needed here is as I said, we were using Search API, and we needed to alter the queries. So all of the queries that are basically being put together in the backend to do that query on the Search API server to give you back the results, we needed a way to alter all of that and basically inject our own logic on the group stuff, on the regions. So the special cases, as I mentioned before, this was a very interesting one because I was, I think at the time, working with Drupal 8 for about 3 or 4 years. Used plugins all the time, but never knew how they work. It was a mystery to me for some reason. And with this one, I saw a nice case where I was able to sort of dive deep into that and see how it works, finally see how it works. And there was a case where I was able to implement a custom plugin, and that would then handle the special cases. So why was this important? Obviously, yeah, the module that was providing the functionality, okay, we could still put some sort of ifs in the queries or whatever wherever the logic was being built. But the thing is, there was a lot of modules, and we also wanted to have a way that other modules might implement their own special cases. So it might be, I don't know, a module was there built for other entities, and those entities maybe had a different case. And that's where plugins basically come in very nicely. And we'll go through the code later, and we'll see how the whole plugin API system works, how it's built, what you need to do, and how we used all of that in our project. And obviously, to put everything together, there was a service, but just a basic service, a manager that held all of the components of the logic and was able to call different things in different places. Basically, just wrapped everything together nicely. So that's the slides bit. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go into the code now. Okay. So as I mentioned, I think the first bit was we needed a way to overwrite our. Is that visible? No. Can you all see this at the back? No. Very quickly. How do you? Come on. No. Presenter mode. Where? Yeah, I can do that. Much better. Yeah, at the back. Still no. Okay. Yeah. It's not gonna work. Let me just increase this a bit more. Okay, will do. So, as I mentioned, we needed a way to gather all of those entities that we want to overwrite and add our new access handler. So there's a very nice hook provided by Core called hook entity type alter. And basically what we have here is this is our access manager, and there's a helper method that will give us all of the entities that we need to override. So essentially we're just looping over these entities that are being given, and then on the entity type, so this is the entity type definition, we use the set handler class for the access, and we set the handler, which is the class given to us by the service. So that's one bit that's taken care of. Then, so these are, let's take a look at this one. So this is the actual class, the access control handler. And what we needed to do here, um, since we were overriding the existing one, we needed to extend the original one. So as you can see here, this one is here called as media access, and we implement our own class, extend this one, and also implement an interface which we need. And in there, we only needed to override the check access method, which is always provided by these classes. Now in here, this is a very basic bit, a very basic implementation. Some other might have, I think the user one is a bit more complex. Yeah, there's a bit more stuff in there, but let's just take a look at this one. So with this one here, we have a is applicable in the access manager, and basically just a helper method which helps us to determine if this entity is applicable for our custom group permission thingy. And then we just call the check access method, which we'll take a look at a bit later. But essentially, this is pretty much it in terms of overriding our custom access handlers. So next up, we can take a look at our plugins. No, let's first start with the group content enabler. So as I mentioned, we needed to put all of these entities, whatever we have, we needed a way to put them into the groups entity. So with that, when you do that, you get that settings in the backend where you can then determine different permissions. And so this, as I mentioned, is the let's take a look at media again. So there's a bunch of different files here. I'm not gonna go completely through each and every one, but essentially it's just, as I mentioned, we also needed a way to gather some of the common functionality and put it somewhere so that, I don't know, if somebody else comes in and needed to put a new entity in, they would be able to do that very nicely and very easily without putting in too much code that was already reused somewhere else. So taking a look at this is a basic plugin from the groups module. It's called Group Content Enabler, and it needs this definition here. And you put this in, clear the cache, and go into your group settings, and you will be able to see and enable this entity to be used in the group settings. As I mentioned, yeah, a couple of different items here. So for example, the driver. The driver is an interesting thing and a very useful thing as well, because it enables you. So the media bit, the media entity is one entity, and then you can also have different bundles. With the driver, it's gonna go through each and every bundle that you have, even if you create it later down the road. It's gonna go over all of those, and it's gonna basically put it back into the group content enabler. And you can see here we call the driver. It's basically going to enable all of the bundles that you have on an entity, and it's going to put them into the groups. Let's see. So this is again the same thing. Let's check the special cases now. So first thing, let's go into the annotation. A couple of things you need if you want to build a plugin. So first, as I mentioned, the annotation. So this is sort of like a blueprint on how the annotation should be built. So if I go back into the group content enabler, as I meant, so we can see this bit, this is the annotation. This is being read by the system, and it's then being picked up by the plugin API. Now these ID, label, description, these are all the properties that the annotation needs to have based on, I mean, a different plugin might have different annotations, but they are all defined in this class here that we have. So in our case, this is a access special case class extends plugin, and we can see we have, yeah, we have the ID, label, type, entity type ID, and excluded entity type ID. So very quickly, the ID is basically an identifier. The label is, again, a label, something that can be read, a human readable name. And then the type, this one was a bit different. So we can have an allowed or a forbidden, which is basically means you can build a plugin that is going to specifically allow you access to the entity or forbid you access to the entity. You could also come by with this by creating two different ones, but this was a much simpler and nicer way. And also we have the entity type ID and excluded entity type ID. So both of these are an array, and they determine on which entity type can this plugin act, or on which entity type this plugin does not act. So that's the annotation. And now for the main bit, the manager. So the manager is think of it as a service which defines how the plugins are built. It defines, as you can see here, a couple of different things. So how are they built? How are they need? Where do they need to be? And what kind of information do they provide? So with here, as you can see, the first bit is the directory. So this is where the plugin needs to be put. In our case, as you can see here on the left side, it's all put into plugin and access special case, and there you have your plugins. So this is defined by this bit of code here. Then the second one is the plugin interface. So this is an interface class which defines which methods the plugin will need. So each plugin that you will create, it needs to extend this interface, and by doing that, it also forces you, you need to put that method in, because each of the plugins are being called in a specific way, and a specific method needs to be called so that the plugins can actually provide that piece of functionality that you need. And then the last bit is the annotation class. So that's the one that we saw before. This one just defines where that class is, so it gets picked up by the manager. It reads your properties, and it knows how your plugin needs to work. And then there is also a method here, so get entity special cases. With this one, as I said, the manager, think of it as a service, as a helper that you are going to use. And with this one, what it does here is it scans the system. So all of the plugins that you build, that you put into your module, this scans all of the plugins, puts them together, and okay, you can also set some different ifs. So for example, with this one, here is the type. Basically, it filters out and gets all of the plugins that are needed for your case. It also takes the entity type ID and the type of the plugin, which was before, as I mentioned, either allowed or forbidden. Okay. And let's also take a look at, so this is the interface that I mentioned before. And the interface says that we need to have a check access method in. So every plugin that you create is going to implement this interface, and by doing that, you also need to put in the check access method. And that is because the manager then that is being called on the functionality that it needs to provide, it's always going to call the check access method. And there's also a base class which you can use for your plugins. This one basically just provides you with a couple of different methods that might be useful for you or might be useful for the manager. Essentially, you put it in and you get access to a couple of different things, namely, so for example, here we have the group permission service, which we'll talk about a bit later. So we have the manager, we have the annotation, we have the base class, and the interface. Putting all those together, you have created your own custom plugin. Now, to be able to use that, you need to provide some plugins, right? So in here, let's take a look at this one. Here we go. This is the annotation that I was talking before, and how a plugin needs to be built. So the access special case, this is the ID of the plugin, and this is the information that we want to give for the plugin. So for this one, it's a permission bypass. This is the label. It's of type allowed, and both entity type ID or excluded entity type ID are empty, which means it basically goes, it works for all of the entities that might be here. And because we have the interface, obviously we also need then to provide a check access method. And in this one, it's a very simple one. It just returns if the account has a permission, bypass group access checks. So this one is basically just we added a permission, and the special case was if this user or this role has the permission of bypass group access checks. It just means it's gonna bypass everything, and he will get access to all of the content. Another one which we can take a look at very quickly is role privilege. So here it was a case where the users that were viewing the content, they had different roles, and not all of them, I mean, they implemented different permissions within the group. And what the client wanted is some role which was a higher weight had privilege over the other ones. So if, for example, I don't know, if the permissions on both roles were a bit different, it took the one that has a higher weight. Again, we see the same thing here. ID label type is forbidden, and it only applies on the user entity ID. A couple of some stuff here for the logic, and then again the check access handler with the logic inside, and it's returning true or false, basically if it grants permission or if it forbids it. Now to the actual service. So taking a look at the access manager here, the main bit, let's see, a couple of methods here, but the main bit is the check access. This isn't the same check access that you saw in the plugin. It's a different thing, but just the method is the same. And this method here basically has all of the main functionality for the group access. Now with our special cases, obviously they need to start before the general logic happens. So that's why both of these here are added before. So we have the check special cases. This is again a method which we'll see just later down, and another one here for the allowed, and then we do the usual group checks, which is the general stuff that's gonna happen. So first off, let's take a look at this one. So what the logic is here is it takes the user that's trying to view a piece of content, and it takes the user who is the author of that content, and takes them both. It finds groups of the first user, it finds groups of the second user, and it sees which groups intersect, which means that user A and user B are both in that same specific group. Now, after it has the group, it goes inside of the group, determines what kind of entity are we dealing with. Could be a node, could be a media, whatever, doesn't really matter. And then based on the group content and neighbor plugin that we have enabled before. So let's say for example it's a node, and the node is enabled inside of our group, and that specific role, the user that's trying to view a node, has a specific role within that group, and that role determines some permissions. So it could be this user can view the node, this user can delete the node, or this user cannot edit the node. Whatever the operation is, it's defined there. So we have the groups. It finds the shared groups. It finds a couple of different other things, and this here, for example, is the main bit, which takes the group and it checks if the user has the permission, and the permission is defined as such, and it also takes it against the account that's trying to view. Yep. Going back into the check special cases. So the plugin by itself, it doesn't really do anything if you don't put it somewhere to do something for you. In this case, it was put into the check access inside of our access manager. And this right now is the check special cases method. So what happens here is it's going to take a look at the entity, the operation, and the user account. And the type is the last one because we need to do two passes. So the first one is for the allowed one, and the second one is for the forbidden one. So what happens here is we have the special case manager, as we talked about it before, and this manager now scans the system, finds all of the matching plugins, and returns them. And now we just go over each and every plugin that we have. Each and every plugin is also going to have the check access method inside of there. And we can see if there's something that we actually need to do. So I mean, not in this specific case, but if let's say we had the permission bypass, right? So let's say I'm the user that has that permission to bypass any sort of checks. When I'm trying to view a piece of content, I will very quickly drop into here into the check access, and then I'll be checking on the special cases. Now, one of the special cases that's going to return here is obviously the permission bypass because it's in the system, it's defined correctly, and the special case manager is going to pick it up. Now, based on everything that I have, what the entity is, what the operation is, what my account is, it's going to put that into the plugin, and the plugin is then going to determine if I should have access to that specific content. So if I do have the permission to bypass everything, that plugin is going to return true, and we will simply go, no, not this one, but for example here, allowed, and it's going to return access for me. Okay, and essentially that's pretty much it, roughly. The last bit that we also needed to make do is list access. So what we did here is, again, a plugin provided by Search API. You can see the same thing, Search API processor. A couple of things that we need to define here. So what this does is this is going to give you another processor. So when you go into the Search API settings, you see that list of processors that you have. And this is going to pop up there as a checkbox. You can enable it. And what it does is, again, it's a plugin that Search API is going to pick up, and it's going to do something for you. And in our case, there are a couple of different things here that are needed, but the main bit again is add group access. So what happens in Search API is that these plugins will get a query. And this is the query that I mentioned before that we need to alter, because if we're not doing that, you might not get access to an entity, which is fine, but the summary that you have on the top is not going to be correct. Or for example, even if you use facets or things like that, anything of those is not really going to be correct. So what we needed to do here, just going to go to the main thing. So we needed, again, a way to determine the same thing as before. So I am a user that's trying to view a piece of content, and that piece of content has an author. And both of us belong to a specific group. So what we're doing here is taking those IDs and we're putting them into our query. So very roughly, it creates a OR condition. So yeah, whatever is already inside of the query, it adds a new group, not the group that, but the condition group, and it puts the IDs of the groups inside of that query, if that makes sense. One more thing here that was also needed is we need to index that piece of information as well, because if we put something into the query, it might not really work because it's not there in the database. So what we needed to do is each time something was created, modified, deleted, we also needed to store the group ID. So for example, when a node is created, Search API picks that up and it indexes it. So all of the fields that we've defined, they go into the index and it's stored over there, which is then being used against the query. So you can basically get that node. What we've done here is we've altered the query to take into account the group IDs. But in order to do that, we also needed to store those group IDs. So as soon as a node is created and is being indexed, we also take a look at who's the author of the node. And by that, we also get his groups that he belongs to. So with that, we get a list of all of the IDs. And that's the piece of information that we store next to that node in the Search API index. By doing that, it allows us to query nodes or any other items based on the group IDs. Okay. Getting back. You can also see all of the code on my GitHub account. You'll see a lot more stuff, but I was just going through here through the main things that were needed to build this and how essentially stuff work. So thank you. And last one. Any questions? Just need to wait a bit.
Okay. Can you provide a palpable example where group wasn't sufficient for your use case, like a scenario where it really shows that you needed to write all of this code because group couldn't solve it out of the box?
You mean why we built the whole custom thing around groups?
Yeah, but not like, the whole reasoning behind it, just an example, like you had a problem, you needed to solve it, group couldn't solve it out of the box, and your code does. Do you have such a scenario?
I mean, it's not a matter of it wasn't able to solve that case that we had. It was more a matter of us being afraid what might happen if we went down that route. Because as I said, there were 40,000 users, and those users built 750,000 pieces of content. And if it were to go down the usual route of groups, there would be a lot of relationship built in the database, and then the queries that we needed to do, we didn't really do any tests per se, so I can't really give you any numbers on, I don't know, the performance bit. But as I said, it was just the frightening thought of what might happen if we do that, and the database. Well, how's that going to look like, and all of the other stuff. Basically, just that.
Okay.
As I said, it's not a matter of groups not being able to do this. You could easily do it but out of the box with everything, maybe a couple other things. So for example, the special cases that we have, obviously that needs to be sort of built a bit differently. You could then hook into how groups handle access and just do it like that.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else?
Hi. First, thanks for the interesting talk. It was really good. I just wanted to know, you mentioned that at the time of an entity creation by a user, for example, a user creates a node, you extract the groups the user belongs to and provide that for the search API to store in the index. So how did you tackle the problem if not the entity, the node, gets edited, but the user changes groups? In case of an access check, it's important that you always get the right group permissions.
Yeah. That was actually a problem that we had. It was also, I think there was some other relationship, but essentially, we used the event subscriber
Okay.
for that. So it's subscribe. I think Search API already provides you with a couple of events in there, and one of them was pre-index or something like that. Maybe
Okay.
don't take me by my word on this. But yeah, we used event subscriber, and basically when something like that did change, we made sure that that piece of content in the index was then re-indexed.
Okay.
I think there's a method in there with which you can sort of flag it as like old or changed or something like that. And once that happens, it's basically the same as, I don't know, you were to change a note or a field on the note. You know, it goes through the same process then, and
Okay.
it re-indexes the content.
Perfect. Thank you.
So hi, thanks for
Hi.
a great presentation. It's nice to see that you were able to dive in it. Quite good to see that. So my question would be about user geolocation. If it's possible to link it with advanced group permissions. So for example, if you have let's say a content for only for users coming from Belgium, and then you have a couple of users coming, let's say from Turkey, and you deny access, maybe by using custom plugins. Is it possible?
You mean the special case plugins that we had?
Yeah, I mean, whatever. So, for example, you have groups or subgroups, and then you have users coming from all of the world, but then you decide to geolocate by country, for example.
Or yeah, technically you could just do that logic in the plugin. I mean, the plugin, the good thing about these plugins is that whatever the module is, whatever the use case might be, you build that plug. I mean, you use that plugin system, create your own plugin, and do your own logic. If that's then based on geolocation, then you can use that in there. But the case that I showed were just, so one was very simple, as I mentioned, if the user has this permission. But the logic that you can put in there is, I mean, the whatever you like. So yeah, I think
basically just using custom plugins would be the solution.
for this case specifically, yeah, I mean, if you were to come right now to me and say, look, we need a special case for geolocation, that's what I will go with.
Okay, thanks.
No more questions?
Oh, one more.
Oh, you have a question. Okay.
Yes. I'm curious about the special case plugin because I noticed that you first run your manager the check for forbidden and then allowed. And then you have a plugin for a bypass. So I was wondering what would happen if I define another special plugin that match the same entity type but somehow collide with bypass. Meaning, say a media, and I want to block everything, but another bypass for that user that has a bypass. So
I think I know what you mean. And I think we also had that. And I don't think we actually implemented it properly at the end, because the idea was that we also wanted to provide another property on the plugin, which would be wait. So basically,
like a priority.
yeah, like a priority. So if there were a case where two plugins might come into play, it would also take that weight into account and then use the first one. But also, no, not this one. Because the thing with granting or forbidding access is basically just the first one that comes there, you know? So if there is a case where you need to forbid access, if it's forbidden, it's forbidden, you know? You don't even need to go down further down the rest of the plugins.
But there could be some scenario
Yeah,
where you want
it
a
could.
special user to have access to that content.
Yeah, again, it is possible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
That's all.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Thank
thank you.
you.